A respected surf instructor, a peaceful beach, a life built on patience, community, and quiet resilience. But one morning, a stranger shows up, not to surf, not to learn, but to intimidate. What begins as a verbal attack spirals into something deeper: false complaints, anonymous threats, a town's silence cracked open. As pressure mounts, he documents everything. Quietly, strategically, all he wants is peace, but justice doesn't come quietly. Now he's up against not just one man, but a system that's been protecting him for years. And this time, someone is finally fighting back. A story of dignity over rage, truth over fear, and the power of standing firm when everything tries to wash you away. Was justice really served, or is this just the beginning? Tell us what you think in the comments, and if stories like this matter to you, like and subscribe so we can keep telling them. The sun hadn't fully risen, but Jamie Cole was already in the water. His board sliced through the glassy waves like it belonged there, because it did. For Jamie, the ocean wasn't just a workplace. It was the only place that made complete sense. Salt in the air, board under his feet, nothing but the rhythm of waves that was home. "All right, breathe through your nose," he called out calmly. "Use your arms like wings, not shovels." On the soft sand nearby, his student, a 16-year-old from Seattle named Maya, tried her best to follow. It was her second lesson, and she was already better than half the weekend warriors who came through. Her mom, Celia, stood a few feet away, bundled in a hoodie, sipping coffee and filming with her phone. Jamie smiled and gave a quiet nod. He was a teacher, a guide, and sometimes a therapist depending on the client. His surf school, Coastline Flow, had grown steadily over the last 5 years. He kept things small and safe, never more than 2 students at a time. He was fully licensed, insured, and carried emergency training certifications laminated in a folder back in his van, not that anyone had ever needed it. He waded back toward shore and helped Maya adjust her stance. "You're letting the board control you," Jamie said gently. "Let's try again, slower this time." "Got it," Maya grinned, her dark curls stuck to her cheeks. Jamie was about to turn when a deep voice behind them cut through the quiet. "Hey. You runnin' some kind of daycare here or what?" Jamie turned slowly. A man stood a few yards away, holding a leash attached to a broad-shouldered retriever. The man wore wraparound sunglasses even though the sun wasn't fully up. His windbreaker bore the faded logo of a retired sheriff's department. His voice was loud enough to draw attention from 2 older surfers waxing boards nearby. Jamie kept his hands at his sides. "Nope, just a private surf lesson, sir." "City-permitted zone," Jamie said evenly, pointing to the laminated tag clipped to his waist. The man's eyes traveled slowly from Jamie's face down to his wetsuit, sky blue with a pink stripe running down one side. Jamie had designed it himself. He liked color. The kids loved it. "You got your paperwork for working with kids. You on some kind of list I should know about?" the man asked, barely disguising the sneer behind his lips. Celia stepped forward, raising her phone. "Excuse me." Jamie raised a calming hand toward her, not taking his eyes off the man. "This is Maya's mom," Jamie said firmly. "She's right here." The man's expression didn't change. "Not what I asked. What I asked was, how do we know you're safe?" "I follow every legal requirement the city has," Jamie said. "Background checks, fingerprinting, insurance, CPR certified. You can call Parks and Rec if you need to verify." The man stepped closer. His dog barked once, sharp and loud. "I don't like your kind crawling around this beach pretending to be something you're not." Jamie didn't flinch. Celia's phone was still recording. "I'm exactly what I say I am," Jamie replied, voice low and even, "a surf instructor." The man tilted his head. "You don't talk like a man." Jamie blinked once. The ocean behind him hummed like a distant engine. Maya stood frozen on the sand. Jamie took one slow step in front of her. "You're making a scene on a public beach," Jamie said. "I suggest you move on." The man's eyes flicked to the GoPro attached to Jamie's board, red light blinking. His jaw tightened. "You think hiding behind cameras makes you untouchable?" he spat. "I think documentation keeps people honest," Jamie said. The man gave one last look, turned on his heel and walked off toward the parking lot, dragging his dog behind him. The retriever looked back almost sheepishly before following. Jamie let out a breath. Celia stepped beside him. "Do you want me to send you the video? I got the whole thing." Jamie nodded once. "Please, time-stamp it if you can." Maya looked up at him. That guy was nuts. Jamie turned to her, forcing a smile. "Unfortunately, this happens more than you'd think." She nodded slowly. "I want to keep surfing," she said. "You sure?" "Yeah, he doesn't get to ruin it." Jamie felt something stir in his chest, not anger, not quite pride either, something deeper, something like resolve. "All right," he said. "Let's go again, and this time look where you want to go, not where you're afraid to fall." They returned to the water. Behind them, a red Jeep with a back the blue bumper sticker peeled out of the parking lot. But Jamie didn't look back. The ocean was ahead and the camera was still rolling. Jamie rinsed sand from his wetsuit with a garden hose, careful not to splash Luna, who was lounging in a patch of sun on the deck. The rhythm of water against fabric helped steady his thoughts. He'd had hecklers before, people staring too long or muttering when they saw the stripe on his wetsuit, but this morning had been different. That man hadn't come to gawk, he came to dominate. Jamie didn't like to dwell. He preferred motion, surfing, teaching, cleaning boards, but the man's voice echoed every time the water hit the porch. Don't think your rainbow wetsuit makes you special. He dried his hands and stepped inside, dropping his board in the hallway corner. His house was modest, filled with sea glass in jars, surf trophies half hidden under stacks of field guides, and a kettle that always whistled just a little too early. Familiar, steady. He plugged in the GoPro. Red light blinked once, then opened to the frozen image of Chad Walker, lips curled, dog leash tight in hand. Jamie watched the first few seconds, then stopped. That was enough for now. He opened his laptop and wrote down what happened in a clean, factual tone. Not because he expected it to go anywhere, but because it mattered to remember things exactly as they were, unflinching, unsentimental. If he ever needed to explain it, he didn't want to rely on memory. He wanted truth. Before closing the file, he attached the video and saved it twice, once to his external hard drive, once to the cloud. He didn't post it, not yet. That afternoon, Jamie walked Luna down to the cafe near the pier. The owners were a retired couple from Oregon who let dogs sit on the patio and always gave Luna a biscuit. "You look tired," said Marla, handing him an iced coffee. "Early surf lesson," Jamie said. Marla raised an eyebrow. "Something happened." Jamie hesitated. "Yeah." He told her not every detail, just enough. She grew quiet, mouth tightening. "I've heard of that guy," she said finally. "Used to bark at the teenagers skating by the boardwalk. Said they were ruining his town. Someone told me he was a cop once." Jamie nodded slowly. "Still acts like one." Marla sighed and looked past him toward the water. "You want me to keep an ear out?" "I wouldn't mind." She tapped his coffee lid twice before walking off. When Jamie got home, he found a text from Celia, the mom from the surf lesson. She'd clipped the video from her phone and uploaded it. It wasn't public, just a private link with the words, "Let me know if this helps. Maya says she's proud of you." Jamie watched the video once. It caught everything. The slurs, the tone, the silence after. He didn't cry, but his jaw tightened the way it did before a hard paddle, the kind where the ocean doesn't want to let you in. He saved the video and wrote her back. "It does, thank you." By the third day, things settled. The ocean had turned choppy and tourists stayed inland. Jamie filled the quiet with gear maintenance, rewaxing boards, adjusting straps, retaping a cracked fin box on his spare longboard. He moved slowly, methodically, like he always did when his mind wouldn't stop turning. Natalie dropped by unannounced that evening, wearing her usual hoodie and headphones around her neck. "You okay?" she asked, flopping onto his couch. Jamie nodded, handed her a root beer from the fridge. She paused, looking at him. "I saw the video. Celia showed Maya and Maya posted a snippet to her private story. It's going around." Jamie frowned. "I didn't want it out yet." "She only showed like 10 people, but people are talking." Jamie leaned against the counter. "I wanted to handle it quietly." "Why?" Natalie asked. "That guy went full caveman. People should see what it's like for us even here." "I'm not trying to go viral." "Maybe not," she said, "but what if it helps someone else?" He didn't answer right away. Natalie shrugged. "Anyway, just thought you should know. You're getting attention whether you want it or not." The next morning, Jamie stopped by Finch and Foam, the surf shop where he bought most of his gear. Walt, the owner, was flipping through a shipping invoice, muttering to himself. "Morning, Jamie." "Mornings." Jamie ran a hand over the wax combs by the register, then looked up. "You ever hear of a guy named Chad Walker?" Walt didn't look up right away. "Walker," he said, as if testing the name. "Yeah, big mouth, used to be with the sheriff's department, retired 5 years back, still throws weight around. He came after me on the beach." Walt's jaw moved slowly. "Because of?" Jamie nodded once. Walt exhaled. "He's done that before, not always to your face, but he's had words for some of the newer instructors. Doesn't like anyone he doesn't recognize." "Anyone different?" "Exactly." Jamie waited. "I'll ask around," Walt said finally, quietly. Later that afternoon, Jamie was restocking his van with wetsuits when a silver Prius pulled into the lot beside him. A woman stepped out, sunglasses, clipboard, city badge clipped to her belt. "Jamie Cole." He turned. "Yeah. I'm Marin Drake, Civil Rights and Inclusion Committee. I'd like to talk if you've got a moment." Jamie blinked, didn't know that committee existed. Most people don't, it's new. She smiled, someone flagged a video that involved you. A surf lesson and a confrontation. Jamie's pulse ticked up slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. I've seen the clip, she said. I just wanted to check in off the record. I'm handling it, Jamie said. I figured, still, if you want to file anything formal or if you need someone in your corner, I can help. And not just with that one guy. Sometimes things like this aren't just about one guy. Jamie looked at her, steady, measuring. I've been documenting. That's good, she said. I'll leave you my card. If it escalates, don't wait too long. She walked off, leaving behind a clean business card and on the back a handwritten number. He stood there a moment, watching the wind ripple through the trees behind the surf lot. The ocean was churning again, restless under gray skies. He folded the card and slipped it into his back pocket. This wasn't over, he knew it. The man on the beach wasn't the end of the story. He was just the start of a deeper current, and Jamie was already paddling into it. The first sign came in an envelope. Jamie found it wedged under the windshield wiper of his van outside the rec center. Plain white. No name, no return address. Inside, a printed notice with a city logo at the top. Reminder, business permit review required, code 42.5. He frowned. His permit wasn't due for another 6 months. He knew the codes. He'd filed every renewal on time since he started. Still, he reread the letter, checking for a signature. There wasn't one, just an office extension to call. Back at home, Jamie made the call. After 2 transfers and a 10-minute hold, a tired-sounding city employee confirmed what Jamie already knew. Nope, she said. You're up to date. That letter didn't come from us. Jamie thanked her and hung up. The paper sat on the counter beside his coffee mug. Something about it felt off, not just that it was fake, but that it had been delivered like a threat. Quiet, meant to unsettle. He folded it once and dropped it into his growing file. A few days later, one of his regulars canceled without explanation, then another, and another. He texted politely, asking if everything was okay. One responded, just taking a break. Another didn't reply at all. At first, he chalked it up to spring schedules. People got busy, but then Celia messaged him. Jamie, thought you should know someone called me, asked questions about Maya's lesson, said they were investigating complaints, claimed they were with child safety. Jamie stared at the screen, his hands were cold. Did they give a name? Number wouldn't say. I didn't tell them anything, I just hung up. But it was weird, scared me a little. Jamie thanked her and sat down at the kitchen table. This wasn't random. Someone was making moves behind the scenes, stirring fear and planting doubt. The man on the beach hadn't gotten what he wanted that day, so now he was trying a different angle. That weekend, Jamie ran into Walt again outside the surf shop. Walker's been talking, Walt said quietly, saying you're pushing some kind of agenda, that you made him look bad on purpose. Jamie narrowed his eyes. Did he actually say that? Something like it. Heard it from someone who heard it from him. He's trying to frame it like you baited him, that you've got some activist scheme and that it's all fake outrage. Jamie clenched his jaw. He's lying. I know, Walt said, but it's a small town, you know how rumors spread. Jamie nodded. He did know. A whisper here, a pause in conversation there. Suddenly, people started avoiding you even if they didn't say why. Walt scratched his chin. There's more. His brother-in-law works for code enforcement, the guy who does surprise checks on beach permits. Jamie exhaled through his nose. So the fake letter. Probably a warning or a test, see if you'd panic. Jamie didn't respond right away. Listen, Walt added, you've got allies. People respect what you've built, but you've got to be smart. If he's coming after you through back channels, he's not acting alone. Jamie thanked him and left, walking straight to the beach. He didn't surf that day. Just walked the shoreline, Luna at his side, letting the tide curl around his ankles. He didn't like feeling hunted. But he also wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Back home, he called Marin. She picked up after the second ring. I think the pushback just started, he said. She didn't sound surprised. What happened? He told her about the letter, the calls, the cancellations. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. This is how it works, she said. You shine a light and people start moving in the shadows. Jamie sat down at his desk. I want to know what else he's done. I want names, patterns. I want to know if I'm the first person he's tried to intimidate off that beach. You're not, she said, but most don't file anything, they just leave. I'm not leaving. I didn't think you would. Later that week, Jamie received a manila envelope in the mail. This one was real, postmarked, addressed, stamped with the city seal. Inside, a notice from the zoning department. A review was being conducted regarding surf school activity zones, and all current permit holders would be subject to reevaluation over the next 60 days. Coincidence? Maybe. but Jamie had lived long enough to know the difference between bad timing and subtle targeting. Still, he followed the instructions, filed the paperwork, and made copies of everything. He also met with Marin again, this time in person. They sat outside a quiet coffee shop near City Hall. "There's a pattern," she said, sliding a folder across the table. 3 other surf instructors, 2 women, 1 man, all queer. All reported verbal harassment near Cliff Point over the past 2 years. Jamie flipped through the statements. Nothing formal, all filed through community programs, not the city. And none of them reported Walker by name. "No," she said, "but the descriptions match. Dog, age, mannerisms." Jamie closed the folder. He's protected. Or just knows where the lines are. He pushes just hard enough to scare people, but not enough to leave fingerprints. "Until now," Jamie said. "Now he's sloppy." Marin nodded. "And now you've got documentation. That changes things." Jamie looked out across the plaza, where kids were playing near the fountain. "I don't want this to just be about me." "It won't be," she said, "but you're the one who's standing up." The following morning, Jamie's inbox pinged with a subject line that made his stomach turn. "Safety concern, anonymous tip." It came from a city compliance email. Inside, vague language about community worries and potential misconduct during lessons. Nothing specific, just shadows and suggestion. But that was the point. The email wasn't meant to accuse, it was meant to rattle. Jamie stared at it for a long time, then calmly drafted a reply. He included the footage from the beach, the notarized witness statements, the timeline, the permit scans, the full paper trail. He signed it professionally, then sent a copy to Marin and saved the thread. Afterward, he took Luna for a long walk, stopping near the bluffs where he used to surf as a teen. The waves crashed below, relentless and clean. He thought about all the kids he'd taught, the nervous ones who whispered their truths to him during lessons, the ones who asked in quiet voices if it was okay to wear colors, to be soft, to be seen. He wasn't just surfing anymore, he was holding the line. The knock came mid-morning, just as Jamie finished cleaning out the gear bins in his van. Luna barked once, trotted to the door, then sat alert but calm. Jamie opened it to find a man in a city utility vest, clipboard in hand. Jamie Cole. "Yes." "Here to conduct a site inspection. Surf school equipment, registration, beach access procedures, standard zoning compliance check." Jamie stepped aside, motioned toward the van and his garage workspace. The man didn't smile. He barely made eye contact, but Jamie had nothing to hide. Everything was organized, permits laminated and visible, lesson schedules filed, emergency response guides stacked neatly in a plastic crate. The inspector asked a few questions in a flat tone, jotted notes, then walked a slow lap around the van. "Been any complaints?" Jamie asked. The man paused. "Not officially." Jamie watched him go. Once the door was closed, he sat down hard on the couch. It had begun. The slow grind. The kind of scrutiny that wasn't about rules, it was about pressure. About making someone feel like maybe they didn't belong after all. He wasn't surprised. But it still hurt. Later that day, Jamie found an envelope taped to the door of his favorite cafe. It wasn't addressed to him, but he recognized the handwriting, tight, precise. "Celia." Inside was a letter. "Jamie, I've told 3 other parents about what happened. 2 of them have had interactions with that man before, nothing extreme, but enough to raise red flags. One said he reported their son for being too aggressive on a boogie board. The other said he followed their daughter and made a comment about her swimsuit being inappropriate for a family beach. Neither of them knew his name until I showed them your clip. They're willing to write statements, let me know." Jamie folded the letter slowly, a knot forming in his throat. He didn't need everyone to believe him. He just needed enough people willing to remember what they saw. 3 days later, Marin showed up at the surf lot. She was dressed casually, no clipboard, no badge, just jeans, sneakers, and a quiet smile. "Mind if I sit in on a lesson?" Jamie raised an eyebrow. "You surf?" "Used to, haven't stood on a board in 10 years though." He handed her a spare rash guard. "We'll fix that." They spent an hour in waist-high surf, gentle waves that gave just enough push for practice. Marin fell a lot, laughed more, and by the end had managed a clean pop-up that earned a fist bump from a nearby teenager. Back on shore, she dried her hands and sat beside Jamie on the sand. "I wanted to feel the space for myself," she said. "See what it's like when you're teaching, see who's watching." "Anyone watching today?" She nodded toward the bluff. "Pickup truck, same one from last week. I ran the plates, it's registered to a Walker family member." Jamie didn't flinch. "He's not going to stop." "No," she said, "but here's what's changing. The city attorney has started reviewing the footage, and I've got people inside city council who are listening now. The more pressure he applies, the more visible this becomes. You're not in the shadows anymore." Jamie looked out at the water. "That's not always a good thing." It is when you've got the truth, Marin said. People are watching and you're holding steady. That weekend, Jamie hosted a free clinic for beginners. It was something he did every season, just a few hours of basic instruction, mostly for local kids and first-timers who couldn't afford private lessons. He expected the usual handful of people. Instead, nearly 30 showed up. Celia brought snacks. Maya helped demo techniques. Walt donated extra foam boards. A few teachers from the high school stopped by to say hello. Even Marla from the cafe brought coffee and muffins. At first, Jamie thought maybe word had just spread. Then he realized this was support. Quiet, deliberate, standing right beside him without needing to make it loud. They didn't talk about Chad Walker. No one even mentioned the video. But he could feel it in the way people lingered after, the way a few parents made a point of saying, "Thank you for being here." It was like the community was drawing a line in the sand. Not today, not this one. Later that night, as Jamie rinsed out wetsuits under the moonlight, Natalie sat on the porch eating cereal out of a coffee mug. "You know," she said, "you're kind of a badass." Jamie snorted, "Please don't say that." She grinned, "No, seriously. You've got city people quoting policy, parents organizing, a woman with a clipboard learning to surf. It's like the quietest revolution ever." Jamie chuckled, "It's not a revolution, it's just persistence." "Well, it's working." He looked at her, "It might get worse before it gets better." "Probably," she said, "but I think people are starting to see him for what he is." Jamie nodded slowly. "Yeah, for the first time I think they are." The next morning he found graffiti scrawled on the side of his van. It wasn't subtle, big black letters. "Stay away from OURKIDS." He stood there for a long time, eyes scanning the words. No one else was on the street. The sun hadn't fully come up, it was just him, the van, and the spray paint. Luna barked softly from inside the house. Jamie walked back inside, grabbed a bucket and sponge, and got to work. He didn't take pictures, he didn't post about it, he just cleaned it off. That was how you stayed steady, by doing the work anyway, by showing up again tomorrow. The story broke on a Tuesday, it wasn't flashy. Just a quiet headline buried on the local news blog, surf instructor allegedly harassed by retired deputy. A clipped paragraph followed summary of the beach confrontation, mention of the video, a short quote from Marin about emerging concerns around behavior in public spaces. Jamie saw it on his phone while waiting in line at the hardware store. The man in front of him was buying birdseed. Behind him, someone coughed into a sleeve. The world didn't stop turning, but it shifted. By the time Jamie got home, the post had been shared over 600 times. He found 3 voicemails waiting on his phone, 2 from numbers he didn't recognize, 1 from a local reporter. He didn't listen to any of them. Instead, he took Luna for a walk. The tide was low. Sandbars shimmered in the evening light. Kids built lopsided castles near the jetty while gulls picked at scraps. Jamie walked the whole length of the beach and back before saying a word. When he finally spoke, it was to himself. "It's out now." The next morning, he arrived at the surf lot to find 2 news vans parked beside his usual spot. One was from the local affiliate, the other from somewhere he didn't recognize, regional maybe, trying to turn a slow news week into something bigger. Both reporters spotted him at once. "Mr. Cole, do you have a minute?" He considered walking past, pretending not to hear, but that wasn't who he was. He stopped, turned, and said, "You've got one question, that's it." A young woman with a notepad stepped forward. "Why now? Why speak out after all this time?" Jamie looked straight at her. "I didn't speak out, I surfed. Someone else spoke up after watching." She blinked. "Next time," he said, "ask why he thought no one would." Then he walked past them, wetsuit in hand, like any other day. By Friday, the story had grown legs. Someone dug up Walker's personnel files, suspensions, internal complaints, unproven rumors that never stuck. A local podcast did a 30-minute breakdown on the culture of quiet intimidation in coastal towns. Jamie's inbox swelled with messages from people he'd never met. Some were kind, some were cautious. A few were venomous, "You're lying, you tricked him. Not everything is hate, you freak." He didn't respond, he archived them all. Natalie started staying over more often. She never said it was to keep an eye on him, but she brought snacks, blankets, and her laptop and set up camp on his couch without asking. "Just figured the Wi-Fi's better here," she said. He didn't argue. Walt stopped by on Saturday with a cooler of ice and 2 bottles of lemonade. "Your story everywhere," he said, settling on the porch steps. "I noticed." "You holding up?" Jamie shrugged. "Some people are mad, some are supportive, most just don't know what to say." Walt nodded slowly. "That's how it starts. At first, they don't talk because they're uncomfortable. Then some of them realize they're complicit. Then, if we're lucky, they change." Jamie looked at him. "You really think that?" Walt chuckled. "No, but I like the sound of it." They sat in silence, watching seagulls spiral overhead. Later that night, Marin called. "There's going to be a council meeting," she said. "Public forum, you don't have to attend, but if you wanted to say something, people would listen." Jamie stood at his kitchen window, watching shadows stretch across the sand. "What if I don't want to be the face of anything?" "Then don't be," she said. "Just be someone who doesn't lie, that's enough." The town hall meeting was packed. Folding chairs lined the back walls. People stood against door frames, a camera crew filmed from the corner. Jamie sat in the third row, cap pulled low. He didn't sign up to speak, he wasn't sure he would. The agenda rolled on: road repairs, water usage, school funding, then the topic shifted. Marin stepped up first, reading a statement that was clear and precise. No fire, no drama, just truth. Then a mother stood up. Then a teenager who'd been in one of Jamie's free clinics. Then Celia. One by one they shared stories. None of them used Walker's name, they didn't have to. Jamie kept his eyes forward, shoulders still. Hands clasped tight. When the mayor asked if anyone else wanted to speak, the silence stretched. Jamie stood, he didn't clear his throat, didn't raise his voice. "I've taught kids how to surf for nearly a decade, I've never lost one, never had a complaint. I've pulled kids out of rip currents, called ambulances, patched up jellyfish stings. I've filed every permit, followed every rule." A pause. "Until last month, that was enough." He let that sit. "I don't want anyone fired. I don't want revenge. I just want the right to work in peace. I want other people, kids especially, to see someone like me doing something I love without being dragged through the mud for it." Another pause. "I don't need to be agreed with. I just need to be left alone." He sat back down, silence. Then applause, not loud, not explosive, but steady, like waves rolling in. That night back at home, Jamie sat on the deck and watched Luna chase moths in the porch light. Natalie handed him a mug of tea and sat beside him, knees pulled to her chest. "Why'd you do it?" she asked. He took a sip before answering. "Because if someone like me had stood up when I was younger, maybe I wouldn't have waited so long to become who I am." She nodded, quiet. "You think it'll change anything?" Jamie stared out at the horizon. "I think the tide's turning." The cease and desist letter arrived on a Monday. It came certified, folded tight in a crisp white envelope, addressed from a law office Jamie had never heard of. The language was legal but plain enough: cease dissemination of defamatory materials, refrain from public commentary. Potential consequences include civil liability. He read it 3 times. At no point did it mention Chad Walker by name, just a respected member of the community. Jamie placed the letter on his kitchen table beside a mug of cold tea and Luna's half-chewed tennis ball. The ceiling fan spun in lazy circles overhead. Outside, the tide was coming in. He didn't panic. He didn't call anyone. He just picked up his phone and took a picture of the letter, then filed it in the folder he'd labeled months ago, Walker Personal Archive. The next day, the city inspector came again. This time, it wasn't just one guy with a clipboard. It was a team: 3 people, 2 trucks, 1 camera. They walked the beach access path, measured tape lines along the fence behind his van, and took notes in low voices. "Is there a problem?" Jamie asked, keeping his voice even. "Random audit," one of them said. Jamie nodded. "That's a lot of gear for random." They didn't answer, he didn't press, he let them work. Quiet, composed, he answered every question, produced every document, walked them through the same permit copies he'd already sent 3 times. When they left, one of them, an older woman with sun-creased skin, lingered for a second. "You're doing everything right," she said under her breath. "Just so you know." Jamie gave her a nod. That was enough, but the pressure didn't stop. By Thursday, he'd received 2 one-star reviews on his surf school page. No names, just vague accusations: unprofessional, inappropriate behavior with minors. Jamie flagged them, reported them, but they stayed up for days. He stopped sleeping well. The nights blurred into early mornings, and the ocean started to feel like the only thing still moving at its natural pace. He surfed more, not for teaching, just for breathing. The repetition of paddling, standing, falling, rising again, it grounded him. Out there, no one asked questions. No one whispered behind hands. No one filed anonymous tips. Walt came by with groceries. Just a small bag: fruit, bread, peanut butter, but he didn't say that's why he came. He placed it on the counter, sat down, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. "They're coming after your business now," he said finally. Jamie didn't look up. "I noticed. I heard Walker called someone on the zoning board, said you were a public distraction, said the beach was becoming political." Jamie leaned against the counter. "I wear a wetsuit, I teach kids how to surf, that's not political." Walt gave a dry laugh. "It is when you're not who they want you to be." Jamie didn't answer. Walt stood, placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "You're not wrong to fight. But it's okay to be tired." "I'm not tired," Jamie said quietly. "I'm just angry." That night, Natalie found him on the porch, barefoot in the dark, holding a folder filled with his documentation like it might dissolve if he let go. She sat beside him, said nothing for a while. Then, "You thinking about quitting?" Jamie didn't respond. "You'd be allowed to," she added. "No one would blame you." He turned to her, eyes sharp. "I would." Natalie nodded, "Then don't." On Saturday morning, the air was heavy with fog. The beach looked like something out of a dream, soft, blurred edges, water folding in and out like breathing. Jamie had one lesson scheduled. A boy named Simon, 7 years old, first time on a board. Simon's mom, Rosa, stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching closely as Jamie helped the boy into a life vest. "Sorry," she said suddenly. "I almost canceled." Jamie glanced up. "You wouldn't have been the first." She bit her lip, then said, "I read the news. Then I saw your lesson videos online, and I asked myself, do I believe what I see, or do I believe the fear someone wants me to feel?" Jamie adjusted Simon's vest gently. "What you decide." "I believe what I see." Jamie smiled, not wide but real. "Good," he said, "that's all I ask." Later that afternoon, while rinsing the boards behind his van, Jamie heard someone calling his name. He turned to see Marin jogging up the path. "We need to talk," she said, out of breath. "There's been a leak." Jamie wiped his hands. "What kind of leak?" "An old arrest report from 20 years ago. Petty vandalism, Walker's name. It never went to court, sealed, but someone dug it up. It's spreading fast." Jamie blinked. "Why tell me?" "Because he's going to blame you." Jamie crossed his arms. "I didn't touch anything sealed. I've played this by the book." "I know," Marin said, "but people like him don't care about what's true. They care about who looks like the enemy." Jamie looked past her toward the surf. "He's scared." "Yes," she said, "but scared people are dangerous." By nightfall, Jamie's inbox had exploded again. This time with new accusations, people defending Walker, calling the story a witch hunt, claiming Jamie had destroyed an innocent man's life for attention. One message simply read, "We know where you live." Jamie didn't flinch. He copied the message, attached the header data, and sent it to Marin. Then he locked his doors, turned off the lights, and stood at the window for a long time. The moon hung low over the water, bright and quiet. He whispered to himself just once, "Hold steady." The hearing was scheduled. Jamie arrived at City Hall at 9:15, wearing a plain blue button-up and dark jeans, nothing flashy, nothing new, just clean lines and calm shoulders. He held no folder, carried no briefcase. Everything that needed to be said was already on the record. The council chamber was packed, standing room only. A few reporters lingered in the back, whispering into microphones. Marin met him near the side door and gave a small nod. "You good?" Jamie nodded. "I'm ready." "They're here too," she said, gesturing behind him. He turned and saw Celia and Maya seated near the front. Walt was beside them, arms folded across his chest. Natalie sat at the edge of the aisle, notebook open, her eyes already locked on the council table. Then he saw Chad Walker, seated 2 rows from the front, clean shave, pressed polo shirt, hands folded, expression blank. Jamie didn't stare, he didn't have to. The council began with procedural items, permits, public funding, zoning updates, each ticked off like pebbles thrown into a still pond. Then the mayor shifted forward. "We now open discussion regarding complaints submitted to the Civil Rights and Inclusion Committee concerning alleged harassment and targeted retaliation by a former law enforcement official against licensed surf instructor Jamie Cole." Whispers rippled through the chamber. Jamie stood, the mayor nodded. "Mr. Cole, you may begin." He stepped forward to the mic, not rushed, not stiff, just sure-footed. "I've worked as a surf instructor in this town for nearly a decade," he began. "I've taught hundreds of students, many of them children. I've followed every rule, every permit, every safety check. Until a few months ago, that was enough." He paused, looked directly at the council, not the crowd, not the cameras. "Then I was confronted on a public beach by a man who made it clear that I was unwelcome, not because I broke a rule, not because I posed any threat, but because of who I am." His voice didn't rise. "I stayed calm, I documented what happened, and when I did, the retaliation began, anonymous complaints, inspections, threats, lies." Another pause. "I didn't go public, the story did that on its own, and I've never called for punishment. What I've called for is safety, fairness. A recognition that harassment, especially when backed by power, hurts more than reputations. It strips people of peace, of belonging, of their place in the world." Silence followed his words. He stepped back, the mayor nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Cole." Then came the witnesses. Celia spoke first, clear, measured. She recounted the morning on the beach. Walker's tone, the words he used, the fear in her daughter's eyes. Then came Rosa, Simon's mom, who described receiving an anonymous warning call before her son's first lesson. "They tried to scare me," she said, her voice trembling. "But I trusted what I saw." Even Walt spoke, told the room how he'd watched people like Walker intimidate others for years. "It was always subtle," he said, "until it was." Each voice added weight, like waves stacking, pulling power from the one before. Then Walker stood. He didn't approach the mic. He didn't need to. "I've served this town for over 30 years, he said, loud enough to reach the back. "I've seen what happens when people let personal agendas poison public spaces. I wasn't harassing anyone. I was protecting the beach, from political messaging, from confusion, from anything that might make parents uncomfortable." Gasps cut through the room. Jamie didn't move. The mayor raised a hand. "Mr. Walker, this is not a debate on identity. This is a review of documented actions." Walker ignored him. "What's happening here is a witch hunt. A man like me speaks up, and suddenly I'm the villain." Marin stood calm and unreadable. "Mr. Walker," she said, "we have documented complaints going back 5 years from multiple instructors. Many did not come forward publicly, but their stories match. The words, the tone, the dog, the threats." Walker's face flushed red. "I served this town," he barked. "And now you're facing the consequences," she replied. The room held its breath. The council recessed for deliberation. Jamie stepped outside, the doors clicking shut behind him. The air smelled like seaweed and exhaust. He sat on the steps, Luna curled beside him. Natalie joined a minute later, handing him a water bottle. "You did good," she said. Jamie nodded. "I didn't think it'd come this far." "But you didn't stop." "No." He watched a gull ride the wind over the rooftops, wings steady against the current. The council returned half an hour later. The mayor cleared his throat. "Following today's testimony and a review of all submitted documentation, the council has voted unanimously to take the following actions. First, Mr. Cole's permits and business standing are reaffirmed and marked as in good compliance with city standards. Second, a motion has passed to open an ethics review into former Deputy Walker's use of influence and intimidation against local business owners. And third, the Civil Rights and Inclusion Committee will be granted formal oversight authority in future harassment investigations involving city staff or affiliates." Applause broke out, real this time, loud, sustained. Walker stood up and walked out. Jamie didn't watch him go. He was too busy shaking hands. That evening, Jamie stood at the shoreline as the tide crept in. The water was calm. The sun slid low across the horizon, casting gold on everything it touched. Maya ran past him, laughing, board tucked under one arm. Celia waved from the shore. Walt chatted with 2 new instructors Jamie had helped train. The beach looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. "Not anymore." Natalie joined him, a soda in hand, sleeves rolled up. "You look tired," she said. "I feel light," Jamie replied. She smiled. "That's the weird thing about justice. It's heavy for a long time, then all at once it is." He glanced at her. "You think things'll change?" "For some people, they already have." He nodded, then turned back toward the ocean and stepped into the waves. The water welcomed him, steady and clean.